Something extraordinary is happening at dealerships across Australia right now. Thousands of brand new car owners are driving back to the showroom, handing over the keys and demanding their money back. Not because they changed their minds, not because they found something cheaper down the road, but because the cars they bought are genuinely broken in ways that cannot be fixed. The manufacturers know it, the dealers know it, and the number of Australians successfully forcing returns in 2026 has hit levels this country has never seen before. What's driving it, which cars are at the centre of it, and what you need to know before you sign anything, that's what we're getting into today. Why this is happening now? Nobody planned for this moment to arrive so suddenly. That's the first thing worth understanding, because what's happening in Australian dealerships in 2026 isn't a single scandal with a single cause. It's a perfect storm that's been building for the better part of a decade, and it finally hit land this year with enough force to make headlines, rattle boardrooms, and send legal teams at major manufacturers into genuinely uncomfortable territory. Start with the cars themselves. Modern vehicles are more complex than anything that rolled off a production line in 1980. The average new car sold in Australia today contains more lines of software code than a commercial aircraft did 15 years ago. More sensors, more modules, more systems talking to each other through a network of electronics that, when it works, feels like magic. When it doesn't, it fails in ways that are almost impossible to diagnose, intermittent, hard to replicate in a workshop, and maddening for the owner who experiences the fault every second Tuesday, but never when the technician is watching. Manufacturers pushed complexity faster than reliability could keep up, and Australian buyers who were sold on the promise of all that technology are now living with the consequences. Add in the post-pandemic supply chain disaster that saw manufacturers rush vehicles to market with components sourced from wherever they could find them, quality control stretched thin across global production lines running at capacity, and you've got a recipe for vehicles that simply aren't finished when they leave the factory. The second piece of this storm is awareness. Australian consumers in 2026 know their rights better than any generation before them. The Australian Consumer Law Major Failure Provision has been around since 2011, but for most of that time it was the kind of legal protection that existed on paper without many people knowing how to use it. That's changing fast. Forums, YouTube channels, Facebook groups, and yes, videos exactly like this one, have put the knowledge directly into the hands of buyers who would previously have just accepted the dealer's line that the car is behaving normally and lived with it. A quick word before we go on. Most people spend thousands of dollars repairing cars long before they actually need to. Professional mechanics have known for decades that a handful of simple habits can make almost any vehicle last far longer. And I've gathered 101 of those insider secrets into a book called The Mechanic's Bible. I won't mention it again. If you'd like a copy, the link is in the description. When you know that a major failure gives you the legal right to a refund or replacement, and when the car you just spent $60,000 on has been back to the dealer 4 times in 6 months and still isn't right, you stop accepting the dealer's line. You start demanding what the law already says you're entitled to. And that's exactly what thousands of Australians are doing right now. The brand's getting hit hardest. Not every manufacturer is feeling this equally. Some brands are walking into 2026 with return rates that should be embarrassing their global headquarters, and in a few cases actually are. The pattern is consistent enough that it's worth naming it plainly. The brands generating the most returns in Australia right now share a set of common characteristics. They rushed new platforms to market, they leaned heavily on software to compensate for hardware that wasn't quite ready, and their dealer networks were not equipped to diagnose, let alone fix, the faults that followed. Land Rover sits at the top of this list without serious competition. Australian Land Rover specialists and consumer advocates have documented return demand rates for Defender, Discovery, and Range Rover models that are, by any measure, extraordinary for vehicles in the premium price bracket. We're talking about cars that cost $100,000 and above, being returned by owners who have experienced repeated electrical failures, software faults, and in some cases, vehicles that simply refuse to start on a cold morning. The Ingenium engine family's reliability record follows the brand across every model it touches, and the return demands follow the Ingenium record. Jeep is the second name that comes up consistently. The Compass and the Gladiator are generating consumer complaints at rates that don't match the confidence of the sales pitch. Stellantis, the parent company, has faced formal ACC scrutiny over its complaint handling processes in Australia, and the pattern of owners being told a fault is normal, only to have a recall issued for exactly that fault 6 months later, is documented thoroughly enough to be a storyline all by itself. Ford is the third brand, and this one genuinely hurts to say because the Ranger is Australia's best-selling vehicle. But popularity and reliability are not synonyms. The recall history of the current generation Ranger is long enough to make even the most committed Ford loyalist uncomfortable, and when recall notices pile up on a vehicle that's only 2 years old, some owners stop waiting for the next one and start asking for their money back instead. The hidden trigger. Nobody talks about software. Here is the failure category that Australian consumer law never anticipated. When the Australian consumer law was written, the drafters were thinking about mechanical failures, engines that seized, transmissions that failed, suspension components that cracked, physical things that broke in ways a mechanic could measure and a court could understand. Nobody sat in that drafting room in 2010 and thought carefully about what happens when a car's software simply decides to have a bad day. Software failures are a genuinely new category of automotive disaster. The problem isn't that software fails occasionally. Everything fails occasionally. The problem is that software failures are intermittent, invisible, and almost impossible to prove in the way that consumer law traditionally requires. An engine that seizes leaves evidence. A transmission that fails leaves metal debris and diagnostic codes that tell a clear story, but a software fault that causes the adaptive cruise control to suddenly brake hard on an open highway, then clears itself before the car reaches a workshop, leaves almost nothing behind. The owner knows what happened, the technician finds nothing. Drive-by-wire and brake-by-wire systems have brought this problem into genuinely dangerous territory. When your accelerator pedal is no longer mechanically connected to your engine, and your brake pedal is no longer hydraulically connected to your brakes in the traditional sense, a software fault stops being an inconvenience and starts being a safety event. The Tesla Cybertruck recall over an accelerator pedal that could jam at full throttle is the headline version of this problem. But the quieter versions, adaptive systems that intervene unexpectedly, transmission software that hunts for gears or drops into limp mode in 40-degree heat, lane keeping systems that fight the driver on a straight road are happening across dozens of models currently sold in Australia. Over-the-air software updates have added another layer of complexity that nobody fully planned for. Manufacturers can now push changes to your car's software the same way your phone gets an app update overnight, silently, without you necessarily knowing what changed. Sometimes those updates fix things. Sometimes they introduce new faults that didn't exist the day you signed the contract. And when a customer reports that their car started behaving differently after an overnight update they didn't ask for, the legal question of whether the vehicle's condition has changed since purchase becomes genuinely complicated for everyone involved. Australian owners are now documenting software-related faults with a level of precision that's making manufacturers uncomfortable. Dashcam footage, phone recordings, written logs with timestamps, photographs of warning lights. When a customer walks into a dealership with 3 months of documented evidence and a clear understanding of their consumer law rights, the conversation changes. And in 2026, more Australian buyers than ever before are walking in exactly that prepared. The recall to return pipeline. There is a pattern playing out across Australia right now. It follows the same steps almost every time, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. A manufacturer issues a recall. The recall notice arrives in the owner's letterbox or inbox, usually worded carefully to minimize alarm while still meeting the legal disclosure requirement. The owner takes the car to the dealer performs the recall remedy, the owner drives away. Then, within weeks or months, the fault that prompted the recall or a related fault comes back. This is what mechanics and consumer advocates are quietly calling the recall to return pipeline. The recall was real, the fault was real, but the remedy either didn't fully address the underlying problem or the underlying problem was deeper than the recall notice suggested. And the owner, who has now been through the process of identifying the fault, reporting it, taking time off work to get to the dealership, waiting for the remedy, and then watching the problem return, is done. They are finished. They want the car gone. The Ford Ranger's camshaft sprocket recall is a textbook example of this pipeline in action. Close to 13,500 Rangers and Everests were caught in that recall over a sprocket that could fracture and stall the engine. Owners went through the recall process. Some of them then started experiencing related symptoms, rough running, hesitation, fault codes that sent them back to the dealer. And a meaningful number of those owners, having been through a safety recall on a 2-year-old vehicle that was sold as Australia's most capable ute, made the decision that they no longer trusted the car. The legal significance of a recall should not be underestimated. When a manufacturer issues a recall, they are formally acknowledging that the vehicle has a fault that poses a safety risk. That acknowledgement matters under Australian consumer law. It is documented evidence from the manufacturer's own hand that the vehicle was not of acceptable quality when it left the factory. For owners pursuing a return or refund, a recall notice on their vehicle is not a problem. It is ammunition. What dealers are actually doing about it? Let's talk about what's actually happening at the counter, because the dealership experience for an owner trying to return a vehicle in 2026 is in most cases not a clean or dignified one. Dealers are businesses. They have floor plans to service, manufacturer agreements to maintain, and targets to hit. A customer standing in the showroom demanding their money back is not a line item that fits neatly into any of those priorities. So the response, in most cases, follows a predictable playbook. First comes the stall. The service team will look at the car again. Maybe there's a new software update available. Maybe the technician needs more time with the vehicle. Maybe they'll keep it for a week. This costs the owner time, inconvenience, and the continued psychological weight of fighting a battle that shouldn't need to be fought in the first place. Then comes the goodwill offer, a service credit, free scheduled services for 2 years, an extended warranty thrown on top, sometimes a discount on accessories. These offers are not solutions. They are retention strategies designed to close the conversation without the dealer having to escalate the matter to the manufacturer and trigger a formal return process that nobody in the distribution chain actually wants to process. Then, if the owner persists, comes the escalation delay. The dealer needs to refer the matter to the manufacturer's customer relations team. The manufacturer's customer relations team needs to review the case. The review takes 3 weeks, then 6. Then the owner gets a call from someone who has clearly not read the file properly and starts the conversation by asking the owner to describe the fault again from the beginning. I am not making this up. This is documented across consumer advocate casework in Australia, and it is the precise experience that thousands of owners are reporting right now. The good news, and there is good news, is that owners who understand their rights, document everything, and escalate correctly are winning. They are getting refunds, they are getting replacements, and the manufacturers who have been found to have handled complaints unconscionably are being made to pay for it in ways that are now a matter of public court record. Australian consumer law. The weapon most buyers don't know they have right. This is the chapter that could genuinely save you thousands of dollars. So stay with me, because I'm going to explain this as plainly as I possibly can, and I'm going to explain it without using the kind of language that makes people's eyes glaze over after the second sentence. The Australian consumer law gives every buyer of a new car a set of consumer guarantees. These aren't optional extras, they aren't covered by fine print, they apply automatically regardless of what the dealer's contract says, regardless of what the manufacturer's warranty booklet says, and regardless of how many service credits the dealership offers you. The law says the car must be of acceptable quality, it must be fit for purpose, it must match the description it was sold under, and it must be durable, meaning it should last a reasonable amount of time without failing when a car fails to meet those guarantees. Australian consumer law divides the failure into two categories. Minor failures can be remedied by the supplier through repair. The owner doesn't get to demand a refund for a minor failure that the dealer fixes within a reasonable time. But a major failure is a completely different situation. A major failure is defined under the law as a failure that would have stopped a consumer from buying the car if they'd known about it in advance, a failure that substantially reduces the car's usefulness, a failure that creates an unsafe situation, or a situation where the car cannot be repaired within a reasonable time. And here's the part that manufacturers genuinely do not want widely known. Under a major failure, the consumer has the right to choose between a full refund and a replacement, not the dealer's choice, not the manufacturer's choice, the consumer's choice. The reason so many Australians are succeeding with return demands in 2026 is that modern cars are generating major failures at rates the law was never designed to handle, and the word has finally gotten out that the right to a refund is real, it's enforceable, and it doesn't require a lawyer to invoke in the first stages. You need to know the phrase major failure under the Australian consumer law. You need to have your fault documented, and you need to be prepared to escalate through the manufacturer's formal complaints process, then to your state's consumer tribunal if necessary. The Ford PowerShift class action, which ended in a federal court finding of unconscionable conduct and a $10 million fine, is the clearest possible demonstration of what happens when manufacturers ignore that law. 9 years, tens of thousands of owners, a federal court judgment, that's the worst case outcome for a manufacturer that plays the denial game. And the manufacturers watching that case conclude are paying attention to it right now in ways that make the current return wave less surprising than it first appears. The models being returned most in 2026. Let's name the vehicles specifically because that's what you came here for. The return and formal complaint data in Australia in 2026 is not evenly distributed. Certain models are generating disproportionate volumes of consumer demands, and the reasons are specific enough to be worth going through one by one. The LDV T60 is generating return demands at a rate that should be a serious crisis for the brand. The throttle delay issue that owners have described as the most dangerous thing they have ever experienced in any vehicle is not a quirk. It is not a characteristic. It is a documented fault that multiple owner complaints have described in identical terms. You press the accelerator, nothing happens. Then the ute lurches forward several seconds later into traffic across an intersection into a situation that the driver had already committed to managing. Owners who have documented this fault reported it formally, had the dealer fail to remedy it, and then returned to find the fault persisting, are in textbook major failure territory under Australian consumer law. A meaningful number of them are now acting on exactly that understanding. The Ford Ranger, as I've already touched on, is generating a return demand volume that is uncomfortable for a vehicle that carries the title of Australia's best-selling car. The recall history is the foundation of most of these demands. When you have a safety recall on a vehicle that's less than 2 years old, followed by ongoing software-related faults, followed by a transmission software recall, followed by a brake boost recall, the cumulative weight of that history starts to look less like bad luck and more like a vehicle that was genuinely not ready for sale when it left the factory. Some owners have made that argument formally and some of them have won. Land Rover vehicles as a category are responsible for a volume of consumer complaints and return demands in Australia that is frankly extraordinary for a premium brand. The Velar and the Evoque are the two most frequently cited models. electrical failures, water ingress, repeated infotainment failures, and ingenium engine faults are the recurring themes. And because these are vehicles that often cost or over $100,000, the financial stakes of getting the return process right are genuinely life-changing for the owners involved. An owner who paid $120,000 for a Velar and has spent 18 months fighting for a refund is not dealing with a consumer inconvenience. They are dealing with a financial emergency. The Jeep Compass continues to generate return demands tied primarily to the 1.3 Firefly engine's oil consumption issues and the 9-speed transmission's failure pattern. What makes the Compass particularly interesting is that some of the return demands being pursued in 2026 relate to vehicles purchased 2 and 3 years ago, where the fault pattern only became undeniably clear after the standard warranty period had ended. Australian consumer law's reasonable durability standard doesn't care about the warranty period. A vehicle that develops a fundamental engine failure at 45,000 kilometres is not durable, regardless of what the warranty booklet says. Volkswagen Group vehicles, specifically models fitted with the DQ200 dry clutch DSG and the 1.5 TSI with cylinder deactivation, are another cluster in the return data. The T-Roc is the most frequently named model. And the genuinely maddening thing about Volkswagen's position in this conversation is that the faults generating these return demands are not new discoveries. The DQ200's problems have been documented for years. The cylinder deactivation oil consumption issue has been known for years. Australian owners buying T-Rocs in 2024 and 2025 were buying into a known fault pattern that Volkswagen had not resolved, and some of them are now pursuing their consumer law rights with exactly that argument front and center. The EV return problem. Nobody saw coming electric vehicles deserved their own chapter because the EV return problem is genuinely different from everything else on this list. The straightforward cases look familiar enough: battery faults, charging system failures, software problems that strand the vehicle without warning. The Volvo EX30 Ultra recall, which told Australian owners to limit charging to 70% and park outdoors because of fire risk, generated return demands from owners who made a completely reasonable argument. They did not buy a $50,000 electric car, expecting to be locked out of their own garage. The more complex story involves what consumer advocates are calling misrepresentation of range. Manufacturers advertise claimed range figures that are, in real-world Australian conditions, routinely unachievable. Highway driving in summer heat, running the air conditioning, towing any load, driving through hilly terrain, all of it carves into real-world range, well below the number on the showroom brochure. That brochure number is the description the car was sold under. When reality falls materially short of that description, Australian consumer law has something to say about it. That argument is being made by Australian EV owners right now, and some of it is sticking. The broader EV return wave is also being driven by buyers who genuinely didn't understand what they were purchasing. That is not a criticism of those buyers. It is a criticism of a sales process that led with excitement and followed with very little honest disclosure about what daily electric ownership actually involves. Charging limitations, real-world range variation, software updates that quietly change the car's behavior overnight. None of that featured prominently in the dealership conversation. When owners discovered it for themselves, some decided the vehicle they were living with wasn't the vehicle they were sold. Under certain circumstances, they are absolutely right. What to do if you're in this situation right now? Currently fighting a dealer over a new car that isn't right? Here is exactly what to do. Document every fault immediately and thoroughly, every warning light, every unexpected behavior, every time the car does something it shouldn't. Record the date, the time, the kilometers, and exactly what happened. Capture it on your phone or dash cam if you can. Without documentation, it's your word against a manufacturer's legal team, and that is not a fight you want to have unprepared. Report every fault to the dealer in writing, by email, every single time. Not verbally across the service desk where it disappears into thin air, a dated email trail that shows you reported the fault, they attempted a repair, and the fault returned is the foundation of a major failure argument under Australian consumer law. Escalate to the manufacturer's formal complaints process and get a complaint number in writing. Do not let this stay at dealership level. Once you have exhausted that process, take it to your state tribunal. New South Wales has NCRT, Victoria has VCAT, Queensland has QQAT. These forums are accessible, relatively low cost, and manufacturers tend to find their goodwill improving remarkably quickly once a tribunal application lands. And before you sign any settlement offer, talk to a consumer law solicitor. Some work on a no-win, no-fee basis. The PowerShift class action paid individual owners over $20,000. That is worth a phone call before you sign anything. The bigger warning for every buyer in 2026. Step back from the individual cases for a moment. The return wave of 2026 is telling us something fundamental about the new car industry. Manufacturers spent a decade prioritizing technology and complexity over basic mechanical reliability, rushing new platforms to market before the engineering was truly finished, hitting price points that required compromising on build quality. Australian buyers are living with the consequences, and the return wave is the market pushing back. Here is the single most important thing to understand. The manufacturer's warranty is not your primary protection. The Australian consumer law is. It is significantly stronger than any warranty document because the warranty was written on the manufacturer's terms. The Australian consumer law was written for you by Parliament, and no dealership contract can override it. 45 seconds on the federal government's product safety recall register before you sign could save you years of grief. Multiple recalls on a model tells you something about that platform's reliability that the salesperson will never volunteer. The manufacturers handling return demands fairly are building customer relationships that last. The ones running the stall and deny playbook are the ones who end up in federal court paying $10 million fines. The market remembers. In 2026, so do buyers. Drop your story in the comments. Have you returned a new car? Have you been through the stall and deny grind and come out the other side? Are you sitting on a car right now that's been back to the dealer 3 times and still isn't right? Every story helps somebody else who's about to go through the same thing. If this helped, give it a like. Hit subscribe for more straight shooting Aussie car advice. Know your rights and never let anyone tell you a major failure on a brand new car is just something you have to accept. It isn't. The law says so.